the idea of socialism has become very popular among young people. And the reason that it's become popular among young people is because they've been told that it is moral. Not that it works, not that it's great, but that it's moral. It's fair. Capitalism is good because capitalism is freedom.
Winston Churchill said that when you're young, if you're not a liberal, you don't have a heart. And when you're old, if you're not a conservative, you don't have a brain. The Washington Post has an article out today, or this weekend, that indicates similar things. Millennials like socialism is the title of the article, until they get jobs.
You know what, guys? It's time for young people to give these clowns a vicious reality check of their own. Let's educate old people about the harsh historical realities of capitalism that they're just too old, senile, and ignorant to understand. Things have gotten really bad now. It's literally impossible to deny it anymore. Even corporate shills are being forced to admit it now. But fear not, these cringe corporate shills have the solution for you. Corporate shills will often make the case that we don't live under real capitalism anymore. They blame the state of the world on a few predictable recurring scapegoats. It's the Fed printing money, it's taxes being too high, it's the socialist welfare programs. And they are technically right about this. This isn't a pure 100% capitalist system we live under for those exact reasons. So, what would happen if we were to eliminate those pesky social safety nets and regulations holding us back from our perfect capitalist utopia? Well, thankfully, we don't have to speculate because we have a real example of an actual historical era when this actually happened. And it's time we explore that in depth. I don't think young people need to be educated on the horrors of socialism. I think these cringe conservative podcasters are the ones who need to be educated on the infinitely exponentially worse historical horrors of capitalism. Let's get this show on the road. 1800 Victorian London. The early industrial revolution in England and America was a capitalist wet dream. There was no Fed printing money yet, no social safety net programs, I'm talking literally zero, no pesky regulations on child labor or the minimum wage. God knows the economy would be so much better if we just didn't have the minimum wage, right? Literally everything capitalists blame the situation on today didn't exist yet. Just for the cherry on top, perhaps the only thing more capitalist than the economic policies of the time was the general mentality of the public. The rich elites at the top called the working poor lazy. They told them that if they just worked harder, they could pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And much like how you have broke people defending billionaires today, a lot of the poor back then fell for this capitalist brainwashing as well and blamed themselves for their abject poverty. This is their very definition of real capitalism. So, how was life back then? Was it the happy free market capitalist paradise that they would have you expect? The answer is it was quite literally the worst in all of human history. Now let me emphasize, I'm not someone who uses the phrase all of human history as hyperbole. I've made hundreds of videos studying human history in depth and have extensively researched countless historical eras from hunter-gatherers to medieval peasants. And I'm very confident in saying that the era of real capitalism was the absolute worst in all of human history. I'm talking about public health conditions worse than the Black Plague, working conditions worse than the Soviet gulags, and an average life expectancy of 19 years old in some places. Before you proceed, I should warn you that this is a very dark and heavy topic, but it's an absolute necessary one to remind old people about the horrors of real capitalism. Part 1, Capitalism versus the Black Plague. If I were to ask you which era in human history had the absolute worst public health conditions, you'd probably answer the Black Plague as an easy no-brainer. I certainly did before researching this video, and that's because it's really hard to imagine anything worse than that is even possible. After all, we are talking about a horrific, deadly disease that wiped out 30 to 40% of the entire European population. And yet, despite this, credible historians across the board universally agree that Victorian-era London was worse. And here's why. For starters, the bubonic plague, as bad as it was not a constant threat that was always there 24/7. Outbreaks happen in bursts and rhythms, typically lasting for a few days up to a few weeks, with of course the most deadly peak lasting about 4 years. But when outbreaks temporarily subsided, public health and sanitation levels more or less settled back down to normal medieval levels, which, to be clear, weren't great by any means, but aren't even close to as bad as the horrors of capitalism, which you're about to see now. The population of London had exploded to 2 million people by 1850, and nowhere was this massive influx of people more felt than working class districts such as Whitechapel, Southwark, and Shadwell. Here, families lived in what we'll call capitalist blocks, where up to 10 or more people were shoved into single, windowless rooms with absolutely no ventilation. It was so crowded that people literally had to take turns sleeping in different shifts just to get through the day. Despite working over 16 hours a day in deadly factory conditions, this was all people could afford back then, as their capitalist landlords jacked up rent prices to economically enslave them to their miserable jobs, which you probably find relatively relatable as a young person watching this right now. The elites back then constantly gaslit you, telling you that you were lazy, that if you couldn't afford your own place, it was your own fault, and that you should just get another roommate. Sound familiar? The squalid, crowded conditions of these capitalist blocks created the perfect petri dish conditions for many horrible diseases to spread relentlessly. London didn't have a sewage system until the very late 1850s. Sewage is something we take for granted today, but if it ever randomly stopped working for whatever reason, trust me, you would notice very quickly. You would smell it very quickly. A city of 2 million people with no waste management system became a disease-ridden cesspool. The human waste of 2 million people had to go somewhere, and usually that meant cesspits under the houses, drainage channels dug onto the street, and most often directly into the Thames River. The very same river most people relied on for their drinking water, by the way. Yes, they were literally drinking out of a toilet at that point. It's important to note that this wasn't simply an issue of technology not being advanced enough either. Ancient Rome had an advanced sewer system some 2,000 years before that. Archaeologists have even discovered a mysterious ancient civilization known as the Indus Valley Civilization that had an advanced sewage system and a flushable toilet in every single household over 4,000 years ago in 2600 BC. Victorian London, despite having an over 4,500-year advantage in technological progress, still hadn't made a basic sewer system. This is for the simple fact that building a comprehensive city-wide sewer system would be a very costly public project requiring higher taxes. It would not be a privately owned business, and thus it wasn't very commercially viable in a for-profit context. It represented everything capitalists hate the most, which is why the elite capitalist class vehemently opposed it at the time. So far, we've covered the horrible conditions of real capitalism on the land and in the water, but when you turn your head to the sky, somehow things get even far worse. 19th century London was a massive coal-burning greenhouse. This level of burning was a necessary feature of capitalism needed to power factories, steam engines, and textile mills. By the 1850s, London was constantly burning millions of tons of coal per year. Capitalist industries were constantly pumping out soot, coal smoke, sulfuric fumes, acidic gases, metal dust, and much more stuff you definitely don't want in your lungs. Once again, unlike the Black Plague, which came in bursts and waves, under real capitalism, you were constantly breathing this stuff from the time you were born to the time you died, which, as you'll soon see, usually wasn't a very long time. To make matters even worse, public streets in London at the time were extremely narrow and poorly ventilated. This meant that the toxic air was totally trapped in with nowhere else to go but into the lungs of the people. This, by the way, is another inherent feature of capitalism. Improving public streets and city layouts would have had to be a publicly funded project requiring strict regulation and higher taxes, which are both things that we all know capitalists absolutely hate. When you combine the squalid living conditions of the slums, the disease-ridden wastewater that people regularly had to drink, and the plethora of toxic chemicals in the air, there are not even enough words in the English language to describe how many diseases, health hazards, and deadly toxins you were exposed to every second of every day just for existing. Literally, just for breathing. And now you see why historians universally agree that this was literally worse than the Black Plague from a public health standpoint. The Black Plague was, at the end of the day, a singular threat. An extremely horrible one, to be clear, but still just one. Under real capitalism, you were exposed to literally hundreds of threats all the time, every moment of your life. Now, you might be thinking, with how bad things already are, they can't possibly get even worse, right? Wrong, because we haven't even gone to work yet. Part 2, capitalism versus the Soviet gulags. Now, capitalists love using the Soviet gulags as the end-all be-all trump card to prove how horrible socialism is and why young people needed to be reminded of the horrors of it. Now, just to be clear, I'm not here to defend the gulags or socialism/communism as a whole. I'm merely here to educate and remind ignorant, naive, old people of the horrors of capitalism. The harsh historical reality that capitalists do not want to confront is that, by many metrics, as bad as the Soviet gulags were, Victorian-era factories were arguably far worse. An important nuance that always gets left out when discussing the Soviet gulags is that not every gulag was the same. Soviet gulags, generally speaking, can be divided into 3 tiers. Tier 1, the light gulag, which was reserved for more skilled political prisoners doing research admin tasks. Tier 2 are the standard ones, which involve forced manual labor in Siberian industrial camps. This, by the way, is where the overwhelming majority of gulag prisoners were sent. Finally, we have the Tier 3 hell gulags. And this is the one capitalists are referring to when they constantly shout gulags down your throat. This was the absolutely hellacious gulag camps of 10 to 14 hours of forced labor, mining gold and precious metals in the freezing -50-degree Arctics. One thing that's important to point out, not to defend communism, but for historical accuracy's sake, is that as bad and inexcusable as Tier 3 gulags were, they actually made up a very small minority of gulag prisoners. There were actually more prisoners in the Tier 1 light gulags than in the Tier 3 hell gulags. Victorian-era factory conditions under real capitalism, by many objective metrics, were at least worse than both Tier 1 and Tier 2 gulags, and in some ways, literally worse than all 3. Let's start with the issue of child labor. As horrific as Soviet gulags were, one thing they did not do was force 5-year-old children to work in industrial factories of death. Soviet law, even under Stalin, prohibited child labor under the age of 14. Occasionally older teens around the ages of 15 to 17 ended up in the camps with their parents, but you never saw toddlers crawling under machines for basic survival. Victorian-era real capitalism, on the other hand, was specifically and inherently built off the backs of deadly, inhumane child labor. This didn't just happen under capitalism. This is a fundamental, direct result of capitalism itself. Just like capitalist bosses today, capitalist bosses back then wanted to extract as much profits of the working class as humanly possible. And as we've all known and experienced working under modern capitalism, the easiest and most direct way to do this is to pay your workers less. Now, thankfully, we do have some regulations on capitalism today, which at least protects children from the horrors of capitalism. But back then, under real capitalism, no such regulations existed. And as a result, children as young as 5 years old were quite literally worked to death on a regular basis. Capitalist business owners loved having child labor because children were easy to bully, control, and intimidate. They didn't have the ability to stand up, protest, or fight for higher wages the way adults did. One specific way children were incredibly useful to capitalist business owners at the time was that they were smaller, nimbler, and more agile, meaning they could crawl under machines and fit into tight spaces around factories that adults simply couldn't. Textile mills back then were a literal human slaughterhouse. Loud machinery deafen your ears like a rock music concert. Flying shutters and exposed gears were dangerous weapons that could maim or even kill you at any given moment. Toxic clouds of cotton dust proliferated into the air, and this is where 5-year-old children had the job of crawling under deadly machines to clean up the loose cotton remnants. If you've ever played a deadly video game where you constantly have to jump over, dodge, and duck under deadly sharp objects just to survive, this is what daily life was like for a 5-year-old child under real capitalism. Of course, the one key and obvious difference being that this didn't happen in a video game. This happened in real life with real consequences. If a child slightly misjudged the timing of a closing flying shutter by just a split second, arms were crushed, legs were torn off, scalps were ripped clean open. This, by the way, was not a blue moon black swan event the way it is today. This was a regular, constant occurrence under real capitalism. Even surviving day-to-day life in the factory required intense concentration from 5-year-old children. Of course, capitalism even made that part of their lives harder too. The intense 100-degree heat in factories, alongside the deafening noise of machines, meant that concentration itself was a hell of an impossible task. Children back then reported hallucinations from the sheer heat and exhaustion of it all. Think back to when you were a 5-year-old kid playing Mario on the Nintendo. Except now, every time you fall, you actually die. Every time you land on the spikes, you actually lose a leg. And every time you get hit by a fireball, you actually get burnt. Now imagine being forced to play this game 14 hours a day in deafening noise, 100-degree heat, and you only get 1 life instead of 3. That is your life as a 5-year-old child under real capitalism. Beyond the horrific, heartbreaking stories and anecdotes, we do also have empirical evidence and data showing just how horrible real capitalism was. Child mortality rates in the Victorian era were as high as a staggering 50 to 60% before the age of 5. Now, defenders of capitalism will often rebut this by saying child mortality rates in pre-industrial societies were high in general as well, but the facts and numbers just don't support this claim. It is true that the child mortality rate was high across the board in the ancient world as well. But even if you account for that, the estimated child mortality in the ancient Roman Empire and the Middle Ages hovers around 30 to 40%. Still barely half that of 19th century Victorian London. We see this reflected in overall lifespans as well. The average lifespan throughout history is a bit misleading because it's heavily skewed down due to child mortality rates. In the ancient world, average lifespans were around 30 to 40 years, depending on the era, because so many people sadly died young. But it's not nearly as bad as the average lifespan in Victorian London. In many Victorian capitalist blocks, such as the Whitechapel and the Old Nickel, average lifespans were as low as a horrifying 18 to 19 years old. This is because not only was child mortality even higher than in the ancient world, even if you managed to survive childhood, you'd be lucky to make it to 40 with all the horrible health hazards flying around that we discussed earlier. Even the Soviet gulags under Stalin weren't this bad. The horrific exploitation of child labor alone is a big enough factor to make a legitimate case that capitalism was even worse than communism. But there's still more to be said. Now, when it comes to the labor conditions of working adults, this is where the comparison is a lot closer, to be fair. If you were to go by the metric of total hours worked per day, Victorian-era factories actually involved longer working hours than all 3 levels of the Soviet gulags. But to be fair, I would still say that the Tier 3 Arctic gulags were far worse overall. It was literally negative 50-degree weather out there, and on top of that, you could be physically beaten and punished for not meeting quotas. When it comes to the other 2 gulag levels, however, this is where it becomes a lot more debatable, and you could reasonably make a case for either. Annual fatality rates were about the same. Victorian-era laborers worked slightly longer hours, but in a bit less brutal conditions, whereas Soviet gulag prisoners had to deal with visceral, corporal punishment. Victorian-era factory workers had to deal with thousands of health hazards all over the land, water, and air. One type of oppression was political, the other economic. Both were horrible, inhumane, and indefensible. But that's kind of the point. We do constantly bring up the gulags in modical political discourse around socialism, but we never bring up the horrifying conditions of Victorian London when critiquing capitalism. Why? Well, it's for the simple fact that history is written by the winners, and capitalists, to their credit, are much better at dishonest revisionist history than actually running the economy. I'll end the video with this. You're probably wondering by now, if factory conditions were so horrible, why did so many people flock to the factories for work? The answer is, they didn't. This is the version of history you learn in your capitalist history books, but it's not what actually happened. The reality is that people were forcibly kicked off their farms in the village with over 5,200 legal motions known as the Enclosure Acts. They literally set machines on fire and burned them to the ground to protest Industrial Revolution working conditions, but the government didn't care about them. They cared about capitalist profits. In an obsession to rapidly industrialize, millions of people were displaced from the farm villages they lived in for centuries and forced to move to the factories of death for work. And it's all cutely rewritten in capitalist history books as they flocked to the factories for work. As much as this was a heavy topic to research and write, I felt compelled to do so because historical facts and accuracy matter. The children who were maimed and killed in factories, the workers who died horrible deaths from all those infectious diseases, they deserve better than a dishonest lie of, well, they themselves chose to go work in factories. They deserve to have their real stories told and their real memories honored. So yeah, it's long overdue time we give these delusional clowns a taste of their own medicine. Their narcissistic, condescending attitude towards young people is just a projection of their own historical ignorance and stupidity. It's clear they don't know jack shit about history or economics outside of their own garbage and propaganda they constantly regurgitate to each other and their audiences. So, in this video, we talked about just how bad people had it under real capitalism. And if you like this type of historical comparison video, you're definitely going to want to check out this one right here, where on a more positive flip side, we cover just how surprisingly good hunter-gatherer civilizations had it before capitalism existed. Check it out. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.